So I think we're in for difficult times on all of this. And I think we just need to get some simplicity into the whole thing. Try not to be over ambitious in what we're trying to achieve. And maybe we might be a bit more successful then.
Going back to planting, you've talked about pests and disease pathogens and their impact on various species. Do you think the growing concern that there is about the impact of these things means that we ought to, as well as improving the way we manage what we plant, we should be thinking about planting other species that might be more resistant to things like disease and might offer us new potential uses when that tree is felled?
Yeah, of course, is the answer to that. But we don't have enough knowledge.
Okay.
Post-war, again, there was a lot of work done, particularly on conifers, when we were trying to find mostly conifer species from the west coast of America that we could grow here successfully. And there was quite a lot of research done. We then fell upon the wonders of Sitka spruce, and a lot of that development work and research work stopped. And of course, because in those days it wasn't digitally held, it was all held on, in paper records, and a lot of those records got destroyed. So we lost a lot of that information. So what I'm saying is, yes, we do need to be planting a greater range of species. But if we are planting that greater range of species to make our woods more resilient and to reduce our risk, we need to know what we're planting and why we're planting it and how to grow it. And we don't know that. And my fear is that, again, it's all a bit too easy to say, oh, you need to be planting a range of species, and why aren't you planting Macedonian pine, and why aren't you planting, species of trees come from more southerly latitudes, which are going to react better or grow better in what our climate looks like in the future. Yeah, maybe, but what and how? And if we're looking to reduce risk, what is the point of planting unknown species of unknown provenance that's likely to increase our risk? So work needs to be done there, and that's again a role that government needs to play. It needs to be funding that whole process and speeding it along as quickly as it can so that we do understand what we might plant and how we might grow it. In the meantime, my view on it is, yes, indeed, widen your species that you're planting, but don't increase that number to a point where you're likely to fail.
Tom, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't get quite as granular as Andrew in terms of specific species and what we do and don't know about them. But I think in general terms, there's a lot of talk about native species, and I think possibly the most overused phrase I hear these days in relation to forestry is planting the right tree in the right place, as if there's an obvious answer to what that tree would be in any given place. I think the best description of an answer for that from a forester that I interviewed was, the one that grows. Now we have lots of problems with what we term as our native species, and those that have naturally inhabited this island since after the last ice age. As I mentioned before, they almost all of them are racked with one or other kind of disease or pest or pathogen that's being jollied along by a bit of climate change. So yes, we can stick with just planting our native species, but we're going to find that a lot of them are going to fail and they are going to die. But it doesn't have to be a binary choice, as many of these things are often presented, between native or non-native. I mean, we've got plenty of naturalized species, such as sycamore, which, okay, the squirrels love it, and that is a problem for foresters, but any gardener will tell you that sycamore loves growing in this country and would happily reproduce everywhere and anywhere. So there are naturalized species that seem to be fairly resilient, grow very well, and are useful for the timber they can produce further down the line. So, I think we should be working really hard, and we're doing a bit of work with the Future Trees Trust when it comes to sycamore, because I think we should be working hard to find strains of these species, genetic strains that grow well, that are improved. We should be trying to find strains of species such as ash and elm, which are more resistant to the diseases and the pathogens that are affecting them. And I don't think we should be shy from trying more adventurous species that could be more resilient in a warmer climate. And obviously what Andrew said is absolutely true. You can't just go sticking things in the ground and hoping for the best without some kind of trials, which do take years to perform. But ultimately, I come back to how I started, which ultimately the right tree in the right place is the one that happily grows and prospers in the future.
When I was the chair of Wales Forest Business Partnership, which Woodknowledge Wales kind of was part of and then grew out of subsequently, on this theme, we ran a day down at the Breckfast Forest Garden. And in the 50s, a rather unprepossessing lump of hill was dedicated to planting about 85 different species of trees to see how they got on, as it were. So we had a day there, and we had the wood scientists and the silviculturists and everybody kind of, the processors, everybody in the whole supply chain there. And we went round to have a look at how these species had done. Management had been a bit patchy over the years, but, by and large, it was all still there. And actually, we came away at the end of the day scratching our heads saying, actually, we don't really know. There were one or two things in there. We thought, we could probably be a little bit more ambitious about how we planted Douglas fir. I think the Armorica spruce had kind of done okay, but nothing too fantastic. Sequoia had done well, but you try and sell that, nobody wants to buy it. Yeah, so it wasn't hugely encouraging, which is why it goes back to this my point earlier of, yes, fine, but we need evidence. We can't just guess at all of this.
If we're going to succeed in persuading people to, for example, use more timber in construction, are we secure in the knowledge that we've got sufficient supply of material that we can use in the construction industry in terms of the timber that we can envisage being able to fell over the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years? Or are we going to have to continue to import large amounts of the timber that we're using? Tom, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're going to have to import more because we are, by all calculations, coming somewhere close to peak wood supply in this country.
Peak wood,
after which it drops off quite significantly because, as Andrew pointed out earlier, we stopped planting conifers, particularly in the 1980s. In Scotland, obviously, that has picked up again in more recent times. But we stopped planting any wood. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of broadleaf, we've not planted anything of any use for the last 30 years. And, a lot of our broadleaf woods have been quite degraded. So absolutely, we are going to have to import more. I don't think we're going to have to do a great deal to persuade people to use more timber in construction. I can see that happening anyway. And I think people are already persuaded of it. We, as a timber supply industry, just need to be able to produce the kinds of products that fulfill the needs. Now, there's it's a lot of good work going on in the universities and in industries to use wood fibre and timber itself, but in much smarter ways. I'm talking obviously about things like lamination. I'm talking about things like modification. Hopefully it'll allow me at this point just to have a little plug for what we've been doing here, which is...
Tell us about modification.
Yeah, so for the last 5 years, we've really been working on what is a project to modify British hardwoods at the moment. We will be looking at some of the softwoods later on, but to thermally modify British hardwoods. And this came out of many conversations that I'd been involved with BRE and then later Grown in Britain and Trada about the poor state of our broadleaf woodlands particularly. And what came out of it really was that if we could create a commercial demand for the timber within those woodlands and create a value for those woodlands, it would then hopefully encourage the owners of those woodlands to manage to increase the size of the woodlands, to replant, with a view that there was a commercial outcome for them further down the line. So we started looking at what could be done with British wood, and there was lots of silly ideas about building veneer plants and making doors to compete with China and things, which would never have come to anything. But one of the ideas that came to the surface was modification, and specifically thermal modification, which is what the Scandinavians had sort of pioneered at the back end of last century. And really, it turned out that there wasn't much to learn because it was being done in most other parts of the world. And interestingly, actually, there was a research paper that Trada had from the 1950s where they were already talking about modifying British wood. So we're a bit slow off the mark. Anyway, we over the last 5 years have sort of developed that, working in conjunction with a French modification plant to thermally modify particularly ash, sycamore and poplar, and turn what are fast-grown, relatively unstable, non-durable species that don't have particularly strong markets, and turn them into something that is very desirable, which is a stable, very durable piece of wood that can be used outdoors, i.e. for cladding or decking, which are both quite big markets. And it has proved to be very successful, and the species have responded to it very, very well. We've had lots of testing done on it, and the products fulfill a niche and a demand in the market, and as such they are selling. We will, through this year, we are installing the modification plant in this country, so it'll be the first one in this country, so we can actually start doing a bit more experimentation with some other species. But it's things like that. It's about taking the timber and looking at the markets out there and trying to work out how you can then turn that timber with a bit of clever technology or a bit of clever modification into a product that fulfills that market need. We're past the point where you can cut up British wood and attempt to sell it to furniture makers in any kind of volume with the bark hanging off it so they can make something nice out of it. There just isn't the industry out there for that anymore of any size. So we've got to be able to turn wood into a usable product really for some element of construction. And I understand, I was talking to an architect about a project just yesterday actually, which is going to be, as I understand it, the first project that's going to use CLT made in this country. So wow. That was pretty exciting news, and I think that's something connected to Napier. There's lots of good stuff going on, but the big issue is if you want industry to invest in technology to make these products, that industry has got to have some kind of sight on the fact that the raw material is going to be available in 5, 10, 20, 30 years' time. And that's the data, unfortunately, tells us that wood is not going to be there in the quantities that it is now. And that's a problem. Andrew,
peak wood. Is Tom making this up, do you think?
I wish he was. I wish he was making it up. No, he isn't. I mean, you only have to do the maths, don't you? You look at all the planting that went on. We then look at the fact that planting just stopped. Well, surprise, surprise, the curve drops away in terms of supply in 20 to 30 years' time. It's not surprising. It had to happen. And of course, the other thing is that when we're restocking now, we don't restock the productive area 100%, 100%. So, you take 100% productive timber off, you're probably only putting, 75 or 80% productive area back, if that. And of course, where you've got plantations on ancient woodland sites, i.e. They are conifer and were previously broadleaf, policy encourages you to put them back into broadleaf. So that's, again, loss of more productive area. You've got wind farms coming in, which are taking productive forests out. So it's all going in the wrong direction. And, that needs to radically change. And are we, hopefully we're at the cusp of joining those elements of the supply chain up better, so we realise that if we want to use our own timber, if we want investment in, what are expensive processes, CLT, it does not come cheap, and I suspect modification doesn't either, then those investors have to have confidence in the supply chain and confidence that government will back all of that. And it wasn't that many years ago when, probably 50, maybe 10 or 15 years ago in Wales, where we were told we were having a 50-year forestry vision, and it was all going to be us heading towards these sunlit uplands in terms of production and so on. It never happened. And governments that make 50-year promises, you can't trust that. So we do need, we are in a long-term industry. We do need long-term vision. We need long-term investment. We need confidence. I think the technology is there. I mean, the talk about better use of our timber products has been around for many years, as Tom suggested. And, we were talking about, doing experiments on glulam, and CLT was being talked about some, as was heat treatment of timber, 15 odd years ago, 20 years ago. And it takes quite a long time for all that to come about. But, my bigger worry is not so much in, this added value use of our timber, is will even just straightforward sawmills turning out our 4x2s and C16 construction timber, will they invest going forward if they don't see the supply? On what basis would they? When they might invest now because they see a 20-year period where we should be okay. But if you want to write your investment off over, 10 or 15 years or whatever it is, so in 10 or 15 years' time, will they be making that investment? And on what basis, if the timber's not there?
I'm conscious that we may have skipped over a few things. Are there any particular things you'd like to talk about that I've not given you the chance to talk about? Tom?
Well, you touched on language a bit in previous podcasts as well, and I do wonder whether part of our problem in trying to get a realistic message out there is in the language. And I wonder whether when we use words like manage and productive, this all comes across as being a bit commercial, and I think there is then an inherent distrust in commerce, because commerce is out to make a profit, and therefore that must then have an impact, a negative impact. So, maybe there is something in changing the language we use. Maybe we ought to be talking about nurturing or sort of taking care of, and these sort of things might engender a slightly better reaction. It might just be window dressing, I don't know, but we keep, you hear the same kind of phrases and messages being dragged out again and again and again, and they don't break through. They don't break through. They don't break through because they're not picked up by mainstream media at all. Whereas, other organisations are able to make much clearer claims and messages and protection, and that really chimes because people think they can understand that. It's very simple. You protect something, you keep it there, you keep it as it always has been, and that makes us all feel quite safe because change is inherently unnerving. But we can't honestly give a clear message. If we're going to be honest and we're going to try and create a level of trust, we have to be honest about what that message is, and it is a bit more complex. And a bit more nuanced. But I wonder whether we ought to collectively try and create a language that is a little softer and a little bit less commercial to try and get our message out there.
Oh, very interesting. Andrew, any thoughts on language?
I mean, that is very interesting. I mean, yeah, I'm sure you're right. So, of course, the environmentalists, by definition, are able to use language that might go down better, and there may be this distrust of business and commerce. I was thinking this morning, actually, when they're talking about the budget and, Rishi's big problems of how he's going to claw back some of this public, the deficit. And I think, well, it is very interesting, isn't it, that over the last years, when we've effectively had to switch off industry or parts of industry, how catastrophic that has turned out to be so quickly. I mean, it's not surprising, but it has. And how much is taken for granted by us as a nation and the public about how things get paid for, how we pay for our public services. Where does the tax come from? It only comes from people or industries who generate it. And, the fact that we seem to fail to understand that in some ways. I mean, we're not stupid. The people aren't stupid. But there seems to be a willingness to ignore that fact.
And when we talked about farmers as well, our landscape is covered in farmland. And we just accept the fact that the farmers, manage their land productively for an income. And I guess we accept that because we also work on the assumption that they are growing the food that we're going to eat. But there doesn't seem to be that sort of level of distrust when it comes to agriculture. And maybe agriculture's just been presented in a better way.
Do you think so? I mean, I think a lot of the people think farmers are just, a load of old whingers who, take public money. I mean, we had a minister in Wales who used to call agricultural subsidies the dole.
Yeah.
That's how he viewed it.
Yeah.
He just viewed it as farmers being paid the dole.
Yeah.
And frankly, it's a bit hard to argue against some of that. And if you look at, what actually presses buttons and gets media coverage, it's that guy in the Lakes, James Rebanks, I think his name is, who's writing books about going back to traditional methods of farming.
Mm.
So everybody wants this image of this, wonderful bucolic landscape, which, they don't want to see big combine. And we get that where we're doing timber harvesting. The amount of stick that we get from neighbours, from timber lorries going down small country lanes is extraordinary.
Yeah, but Andrew, I mean, how many people pull over on the side of the road to talk to a combine driver and complain to that driver that they're felling the wheat or the barley? And when the hay bales are driven down the road and there's hay going everywhere and covering the road and there's, it's an accepted part of being in the countryside.
Well, I mean, I was just saying a little story. I remember we were an area of woodland up in Shropshire where we were doing some infrastructure improvements. I mean, very, very attractive woodland, actually, and lots of informal public access in there. And we were just taking a few trees out to widen some access roads and so on. And I got accosted by this woman there, and, why are you doing this and why are you doing that? And, right, okay, I'll spend 5 minutes and try and explain all this to you and explain about, the biodiversity benefits of what we're doing and the fact we need timber and so on and so forth. And she said, it's just like Auschwitz here, with you deciding who lives and who dies. And I said to her, Madam, at this point, you have overstepped the mark. And, that is just not an acceptable thing to say to me. And I'm ending this conversation right now. Wow. And she looked a little bit sheepish, shuffled off. But,
I can remember talking to a farmer about whether he'd be interested in growing trees on his land. And I think I might have even used the language of marginal land. But he was reluctant. He was quite resistant, in fact, and said, look, we're farming. We're principally a dairy farm. We're producing milk. We're producing some beef. It should all be about food security. Why should I give up some of my productive land or any of my land to growing trees? So for them, food security was something that they were alive to thinking about all day long. The notion of timber security, the fact that we're
Yeah.
importing the vast bulk of what we use, didn't seem to feature. And then, of course, when I looked into a bit of the data on meat, I realised that most of the sheep that we have in Wales, most of the lamb that we produce is exported. Most of the beef is exported.
Yeah.
So I suddenly thought, where's the argument about food security? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a complicated argument there. So you've got whole cultural things going on of, people have sweated blood to make their land more productive. We're still in the generation of farmers who can remember grubbing out hedges and trees and breaking their backs to make the land more productive. And we're now talking about planting trees back on that land. So there's a really strong emotional argument about why they don't want to do that. Then, of course, on top of that, you've had governments throw money at agriculture incredibly generously for a very long time, which they haven't done at forestry. And then you've got, on top of that, you've got this problem of, forestry didn't make money for quite a long time. It is now, more so. But, we had a whole period of the 90s, best part of 25, 30 years when timber prices were low, returns of forestry were low, people couldn't see how to make money on it. If you planted trees, it devalued your land. There were no carbon arguments at that point. We had, large amounts of cheap timber coming in from various sources, a lot of it from ex-Soviet bloc countries like, the Baltic states and so on. So, that isn't all that long ago. So it's not surprising that people, the landowners, view it, rather skeptically.
I just want to end really by asking you how optimistic you are, given that we've had quite a pessimistic conversation in some ways, in terms of what the future might hold. How optimistic are you both about the future? Tom, first.
I think I'm split in half when it comes to future supply of British timber. I think I'm probably neutral. I mean, I have significant worries that the fifth generation of our family are going to be able to do what I've been able to do in the previous three generations when it comes to converting British trees into timber, because I just wonder whether it's going to be there in the quantity and the quality that's required to support a business like ours. I'm optimistic that the political discussion has come round to landscape and particularly to tree planting, even if, as we've said, we need to go deeper than that. Not in any way a big supporter of Brexit, but I do think, as far as I can tell, the only silver lining I've come across is that we get to rethink about land use in this country, and I think that's a positive. I'm very optimistic about the role that timber is going to play going forward in construction, in creating environments that are far cleaner and have less impact. Now, whether that's British timber or imported timber, we will find out. But I'm very encouraged that timber in itself will play a much, much bigger part going forward.
Thanks for that. Andrew?
Yeah, no, I think if I have my cup half full in front of me rather than my cup half empty, I think we can be very positive and optimistic. I mean, bearing in mind, I'm coming towards the end of my working career now, and I've spent most of my working career with forestry being, very much the poor cousin, really. It's on the agenda now. We can grow good timber in this country. We've got the right climate, we've got the right soils for it. There is no reason why we can't produce it. We've got very exciting technology, and Tom is investing in that at Aston, which enable us to add value to our own timber. So, yeah, of course there will be challenges. There are always going to be challenges. I mean, we'd be naive to think that there wouldn't be. But from where I'm sat now, having worked in the industry for a lot of years, it is more positive now than it has ever been during my working career.
Wow, that's a really positive way to end, isn't it? So, listen, can I thank you for all the time you've given up?
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Thanks.
That was easily the longest recording we've done, and certainly the longest podcast. Whether you've listened to it in one stint or in parts, I hope you found it interesting, informative, maybe even provocative. There are other podcasts in the series. I can promise they'll be shorter, but no less interesting, obviously. You can find links to them on the Woodknowledge Wales website, where you can find out more about the Homegrown Homes project too. I'm David Hedges. Thanks for listening.